Our next speaker is James Rickards, who is Chief Global Strategist at West Shore Funds. He's author of bestsellers The Death of Money and Currency Wars, and he's editor of Strategic Intelligence, a monthly newsletter. He's frequent television and radio guest and advisor on capital markets to the U.S. intelligence community and the Secretary of Defense. He will be speaking on the coming collapse of the international monetary system. Please welcome James Rickards.
Good morning, and thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here, and I thank the sponsors for inviting me. I give a lot of presentations, and I love doing it. I love, it's fun to be able to present something, but it's also great to meet the people at the different events. And I go all over the world on 5 continents, and it's a great experience for me. So looking forward to saying hi to a lot of you throughout the course of the day. But I learn a lot from the interactions. I speak in a lot of different formats. Sometimes the sponsor says, okay, you've got 2 hours. Sometimes they say you've got 15 minutes. I always show up with the same presentation. I mean, I update it for events, but about the same amount of material, usually about 5 hours worth of material. The only people who get to hear that are students, because that's a captive audience. If they leave early, it affects their grade. But today we have about a half hour. I'm very cognizant of that, so I'm going to go through a lot of stuff. But this is like when I was a kid, they used to have double features. For the same admission price, you could see the Wolfman and Dracula in a double feature. So I have kind of a double feature today. I have a panel this afternoon. And I just want to drop a footnote about that, because a lot of people make claims, and that's fine. We're analysts or we're advisors, and we have a view on stocks or a view on precious metals, a view on the monetary system, as the case may be. I don't like to make any claims without giving the analysis behind it, because it's sort of pointless to debate the claim. It's sort of like saying who was a better guitar player, Jimi Hendrix or Eric Clapton. I mean, they're both pretty good, but that's a pointless debate. You can go on. And so I think the same thing is true when you have a claim. Debating the claims is a little sterile unless you know the analysis behind it. What are you using to support the claim? And I always include that in my presentation, because I don't like saying anything without having something behind it. But today, we've actually got a separate workshop this afternoon, if I can put in a little plug for that, which is on method. So I'm not going to say anything about my analytic method today, because I want to get through the analysis, sort of where things are going in the markets. But this afternoon, we're going to do a deep dive, if anyone's interested, and we'll go through some of the equations and some of the math. It'll be a little more kind of industrial strength, but if you're wondering what's behind the things I'm going to say now, we're going to talk about that this afternoon. So with that said, and recognizing the limits of time, let's jump in. I want to start with a section on war games. And in 2009, I was invited by the Secretary of Defense to help to organize, and then later participated in, the first ever financial war game ever conducted by the Pentagon. And the Pentagon didn't need any help from me in doing war games. They've been doing that for decades. But this was different. The only weapons, if you will, were financial instruments. So stocks, bonds, commodities, currencies, derivatives, et cetera, foreign exchange, all the instruments you're familiar with. We couldn't have anything that would shoot or explode, no tanks or submarines or drones or aircraft or anything like that. And it was the first time it was ever done where we were just going to fight with financial weapons. So we had to write the rules. I called it playing Risk for adults, if you remember the old board game, Risk. It was something like that, and we had to ask ourselves a lot of questions. What would the teams be? Well, you have some obvious teams. We had a Russia team and a China team, United States, and so forth. But we also devised a team of banks and hedge funds. They were a team because obviously in any financial war, they'll be very, very involved in that. How many days would it last? Who would be invited, et cetera. So on the invite list, we had what you would expect. So we had uniformed military. We had people from the CIA, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, different branches of government. And then they have what I call the usual suspects. We did this at a top-secret weapons laboratory called the Applied Physics Laboratory. It's about halfway between Washington and Baltimore, so pretty easy to get to from the Pentagon in Washington. But then we have what I call the usual suspects. And these are really brilliant people, scholars and others, but they work at universities and think tanks, and they're kind of on the list. So whenever anyone's doing seminars like this, these are the regular people that they invite. And that's fine. These are smart people. But I said to the sponsors, I said, look, guys, we're going to do a war. Wars are all about lying, deception, and manipulation. So why don't I invite some of my friends from Wall Street? We'll make it more realistic. So they agreed with that, and so I was able to invite the head of interest rate strategy for UBS, another friend of mine who had run a private equity fund in Russia. So we got them involved. So before the game actually commenced, I had dinner with my one friend who was a Russian expert. We cooked up a plot. He was on the Russia team. I was on the China team. And I said, let's do the following, because you get a couple moves, a little bit like a chess game, and you announce them, and there's a reaction function and all that. So I said, let's do a plan where China and Russia take their gold reserves and put them in a vault in Switzerland. Then they legally create a bank in London, and the bank issues a new currency backed by the gold. And the kicker is that henceforth, if you want Russian natural resource exports or Chinese manufactured goods, you can only pay for it in this currency. We're not accepting dollars anymore. So obviously it was a plot to run the dollar off the road. And we had to use Switzerland and London because we knew nobody would trust the Russians. You weren't going to put your gold in Russia. They would steal it. So we had some good rule of law jurisdictions and, kind of all thought out. And the idea was just to sort of throw that out there and then see how it would play out. We got immediate pushback from some of our colleagues. One professor from Harvard. I'm sure we have some Harvard graduates in the room, fine school. He just laughed in my face. He said, why are you doing this? This is ridiculous. Don't you know that gold is not part of the international monetary system? It never will be again. This is a complete waste of time. Why are you doing it? And after a little back and forth, we said, well, let's just play it out and see how it plays out. And it played out in very interesting ways, all of which I talk about in my book. I got home. I said to my wife, I have good news and bad news. I said, the good news is my team won. The bad news is I played for China. So, but on a serious note, since then, we did this in 2009. And when you do a war game, the whole point is to lean forward. You don't talk about the headlines of what's going on today. You try to take it out 5, 10, 15 years if you can. It takes 15 years to build a new weapons system. So kind of look over as many ridgelines as you can and give the Pentagon their money's worth in terms of thinking forward. So we did this in 2009, so it was 6 years ago. Since we did this, Russia has more than doubled its gold reserves. China has tripled or quadrupled its gold reserves. Nobody knows the exact amount because they're non-transparent about it. They lie about what they have. I know they upped their gold reserve figure, but they've got 2 gold stashes, and this is the one they tell you about. This is the one, the State Administration of Foreign Exchange. It's a sovereign wealth fund. It's run by an ex-PIMCO guy, by the way. They don't tell you about. So every now and then, SAFE flips a little gold over the People's Bank of China, and they say, voila, we have 10 more tons. That's fine. That's just to comply with transparency rules for the IMF. But the actual gold is over here, and we have good data because we know what the mining output is in China, 450 tons a year. You do that for 5 years. There's over 2,000 tons right there. Hong Kong imports about 700 tons. Again, do that for 5 years. There's 3,500 tons added up. You get to 6,000 tons of gold that has shown up in China. They don't export any. I mean, we know all this information. This is not guesswork. The only thing we're not sure of is, okay, how much is private? How much is government? I do 50-50. It's a guess, but it's probably a pretty, it's the next best thing to actually know in the numbers. So you can actually figure out this number. So Russia has doubled their gold reserves. China has more than tripled its gold reserves. China and Russia are acting exactly the way we warned the Pentagon 6 years ago that they might act. Now, that doesn't mean that the dollar collapses tomorrow. I'm not saying that. What I'm just saying is we're in a world in which these things are taking place, and people seem very unaware of it. So I think we can take credit for, as I say, giving the Pentagon their money's worth. I want to come to today and make the point, okay, we did a war game 6 years ago. That's interesting. There are financial wars going on today, and there have been for the last 4 years. So this is not just a gaming exercise. It's not just theoretical. There's real financial warfare going on. In 2012, the United States was in an all-out financial war with Iran. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar. Well, the first thing we did, we kicked them out of the dollar payment system. We said Iran, we said to the banks, any bank in the world that transfers dollars for Iran, you're going to be penalized. Your operations in the U.S. are going to be shut down. By the way, the big European banks, the ones you know, Credit Suisse, UBS, Deutsche Bank, their operations in the U.S. are bigger than their operations in Europe. If we shut them down, that's devastating to them. So that's how we get the Europeans to do whatever we want because we just threaten their U.S. assets. So we said anybody who transfers dollars to Iran, you can expect a call from the FBI. You can expect to pay billions of dollars in fines, which they have. So they kicked Iran out of the dollar payment system. So Iran kind of shrugged and said, big deal. There's another system called SWIFT in Belgium where you can transfer euros and yens. They said, we'll just sell the oil and get paid in euros. Who cares? That's a good currency. We can buy stuff with that. But then it got serious. We got our European allies to agree to kick Iran out of SWIFT. That's actually in sort of policy, financial warfare policy circles in Washington, which I'm involved in. We call this de-swifting. So we de-swifted Iran. Now it was serious because they couldn't get paid in any currency you would actually want to use. They could ship oil to India and get paid in a local Indian bank account in rupees. But what are you going to do with the rupees? I'm not sure how much curry the Iranians need, but there was a limit to what they could do there. They started doing workarounds, gold for oil swaps, they were smuggling gold in from Turkey. But this was very devastating to Iran. Look, Iranians, they like their printers and their iPads and their iPhones just as much as we do. This stuff is smuggled in from Dubai. You can walk around Bandias Road in Dubai and see all the smuggling boats lined up, good to go. They get paid in dollars. The dollars are being smuggled in from Iraq. Pardon me, there were a lot of dollars available in Iraq. So people were taking the money out of the Iranian banks, buying dollars on the black market, paying the smugglers from Dubai, giving the people the merchandise they want. All this under pain of death, by the way. Several people were executed for doing this. This caused a run on the bank. So the black market rate, which of course is the real rate, showed that the currency had lost 50% of its value. There was a run on the bank. The Iranian central bank raised interest rates to 20% to try to keep the money in the bank. That's what you do in a bank run. You raise interest rates so people kind of have a motive to leave their money in. So you had currency collapse, hyperinflation, run on the banks, sky-high interest rates. The Iranian economy was collapsing. We were well down the road to regime change in Iran without firing a shot. That's how powerful these financial weapons are. In December 2013, the president declared a timeout, basically détente with Iran. He alleviated the sanctions, released some of the money in exchange for Iran agreeing to engage in talks on the nuclear enrichment dossier, which have been going on ever since. I'm not getting involved in the politics of that. We'll see how that plays out. I'm only here as a financial warfare analyst to say that that war kind of reached an armistice or a truce, if you will, in December of 2013. Today, right now, we're in a financial war with Russia. Obviously, this relates to Ukraine and Crimea. Nobody wanted to drop the 82nd Airborne into Sevastopol. Nobody thought that was a good idea. So the president responds with financial weapons. So we put financial sanctions on Russia. There's a big difference between putting sanctions on Russia and sanctions on Iran. The difference is Russia's capability to shoot back is much greater. There's a lot they can do. They have a 6,000-person cyber brigade outside of Moscow working day and night. Remember, the national sport of Russia is chess. These people are pretty smart. The best hackers in the world include the Ukrainians. A lot of them are on the Russian side of the divide. So they can shut down the New York Stock Exchange whenever they want. They can do a lot to disrupt our systems. Recently, Russian submarines have been spotted tracking, and surface ships with underwater capability have been spotted tracking the fiber optic cable network, some of which is secret, some of which, if you're diligent enough, you can find out where they are. They can disrupt communications traffic. So you have to be careful. You have to put this in a game theoretic context. So you slap sanctions on Russia, that's fine. But then they shoot back, you escalate, they escalate. Where does that end, and what's the potential for an accident happening in the middle of that? This is a replay of the Cold War. In the Cold War, I'll say it was Soviet Union, but I'll just say Russia, same thing. The U.S. had enough missiles to destroy Russia. Russia had enough missiles to destroy the United States. That's actually a very unstable situation because the temptation is shoot first, wipe out the other guy, you win. So what people did is they said, well, I'll build more missiles, and then if they shoot at me and wipe out a lot of my missiles, I'll have some left, and I'll shoot back and wipe them out so they won't shoot in the first place. We call this two scorpions in a bottle. One scorpion stings the other. The victim's going to die, but has enough strength left to sting back, and they both die. That arms race was actually more stable than not having it because, again, it deterred the other side from shooting in the first place because the other guy could shoot back. And then eventually we sort of boxed that in with some arms control treaties in the 70s. We call this MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. That was the warfighting doctrine. Today we are in a world of mutual assured financial destruction, where if we use these weapons and the other side escalates, where does that end? My concern, I see this when I go to Washington, is the White House has not put it in the game theoretic context. They're just slapping sanctions on not really thinking 2, 3 moves, 4 moves ahead, which is what a really good chess player does. Putin is a black belt in judo. He's an extremely capable chess player, speaks 4 languages. When he and Merkel meet, they don't speak English. It's German or Russian. She's a fluent Russian speaker. So we're up against a very wary opponent. So I just simply make the point that we are in an age of financial warfare today. You all have enough to worry about as investors. You've got to worry about inflation, deflation. Will the Fed raise rates? Will they not raise rates? Bull markets, bear markets. There's enough to be concerned about. I'm just saying that there's one more overlay on all that, which is not economic competition. It's actual financial warfare with the potential to shut down exchanges. And one of the reasons I recommend gold in every portfolio is that gold is non-digital. You can't hack. I mean, I'm talking about physical gold. I'm not talking about, COMEX gold futures. It's non-digital. You can't hack it. You can't erase it. And so, in my view, it has a place in every portfolio because if there's an accident or if a financial war escalates to the point where, you wake up and your bank account's gone and your brokerage account's gone and like, where's my money? And oh, it's been hacked, it's been erased, we'll get back to you, which is going to happen. That's just a matter of time. Things like gold, real estate, fine art, these are the things that you can't hack and erase. So I do think there's a place for those types of assets. This is real, by the way. I just want to make it clear. There's an article in Bloomberg Magazine, July 2014. You can look it up, where the FBI found a Russian attack virus in the NASDAQ operating system. This was not some criminal gang trying to steal your credit card numbers. This was put there by Russian intelligence and military. They found it. They disabled it. Nice job. How many did they not find? How many are waiting out there? I've done a lot of development work for NASDAQ, by the way. Nice guys, but this is the ultimate legacy system. They've just piled garbage software on top of garbage software for 30 years. It's one of the most vulnerable, easily hacked systems of its kind I've ever seen. Again, the threat is real. It's going on. The wars are going on, not making the headlines. But this is something that all investors have to bear in mind when you're doing all your other analysis that this is going on. This is what I call a stylized typology. Don't rack your brains trying to follow all the lines. What we have here, these are large nodes, and they're surrounded by these simpler nodes. There are 128 of them. So I've got the United States and emerging markets, et cetera, just to illustrate the density function or the interconnectedness of financial markets. Now, just to kind of go back to the example I was giving earlier, the United States wanted to put sanctions on Russia, but a lot of Russia's financial business is actually conducted in Europe. So what we said to our European allies is, hey, we want you guys to join us in sanctions. So Russian companies that need to refinance in euros or dollars, but particularly euros, are banned from your capital markets. And that was done. So Gazprom, Rosneft, the large Russian corporations that have hundreds of billions of dollars of euro and US dollar denominated debt are today in the position where they cannot roll over that debt. So the Europeans agreed to that. So the US gets Europe to put the sanctions on Russia. These guys can't refinance. Guess who owns the bonds? Guess who owns the Gazprom bonds? You do. Look in your 401ks. How many people bought, a BRICS fund from Goldman Sachs or an emerging markets fund from Morgan Stanley? Call your broker. Look at what's inside. You might be surprised to learn that there are Russian companies in there. So I only make the point that when you start throwing financial weapons around and start throwing sanctions around, look out for collateral damage. Make sure it's not coming back on you. And in this case, if you have an emerging markets or BRICS fund, there's a good chance that you've got some large Russian companies in there that are not going to be able to finance their debts thanks to financial warfare from the United States. So let's break away from financial war and talk about currency wars. Currency wars are different. These are economic contests. This is the financial war is when you're out to destroy your enemies. Currency wars are out when you're actually out to get an economic advantage. And we've seen them before. The simplest definition of a currency war, they happen when there's too much debt, not enough growth. Too much debt, not enough growth. Because if you have growth, you can grow your way out of debt. Make some money, pay your debts. That's pretty straightforward. But what happens when there's an enormous overhang of debt, the growth is not fast enough? How do you get out from under it? By the way, this was the exact situation at the end of World War I when we had reparations on Germany. It's the situation today. It's not always the case, but when it is the case, countries are tempted to steal growth. There's not enough growth to go around, so they steal growth from their trading partners by cheapening their currency. And that does two things. It helps to promote exports. So, You're Indonesia, you want to buy a jet aircraft. There are only two manufacturers in the world. There's Airbus in Europe and Boeing in the United States. Well, if you cheapen the dollar, maybe that Boeing aircraft looks a little cheaper, looks like it's on sale, so you buy Boeing. Pardon me, if you have a cheap euro, the opposite is true. You might buy the one from Airbus. So that's how you fight these currency wars. We've seen them before. Currency War I. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the history of this. I think you're all familiar with it. But this lasted 15 years, started with the Weimar hyperinflation in 1921-22, through the French devaluation in 1925, UK devaluation in 1931, U.S. devalued the dollar in 1933, France and Britain again in 1936. This was the famous era of beggar thy neighbor devaluations, which ended in the collapse of the international monetary system in the beginning of World War II in 1939, and then didn't get really put back together again until Bretton Woods in 1944. Currency War II, starting with the UK devaluation in 1967. The highlight reel includes President Nixon closing the gold window in 1971. A lot of people think we went off the gold standard in 1971, August 15th, 1971. It's not exactly what happened. What happened was President Nixon shut the gold window. He said to our trading partners, if you make dollars, prior to 1971, if you made dollars trading with the United States, you could take those dollars and trade them in and get gold. And they did. In 1950, the United States had 20,000 tons of gold. In 1970, we had 9,000 tons of gold. Where did the 11,000 tons go? It went to our trading partners. 3,000 to Germany, 2,000 to France, 2,000 to Italy, 600 to Belgium, and so on. But by 1971, there was a run on the bank. The gold coming out of Fort Knox being reallocated to our European allies turned into a flood. It was very clear that Fort Knox was going to be drained, just a matter of time. So the president shut the gold window. I spoke to Paul Volcker about this, and he said, and he advocated for it, but he said, when we did this, we thought it was temporary. And if you look at Nixon's speech, he used the word temporary. We thought it was temporary. And we thought we would just sit down, have another Bretton Woods type conference, come up with a different valuation for gold, which they did. They went from $35 an ounce to $42 an ounce, which is a 20% devaluation of the dollar, and then restart the system on the gold standard. It never happened, of course, and we sort of muddled through until about 1975, and finally in 1975, the IMF said, we're demonetizing gold, floating exchange rates, have it, knock yourself out. So the gold standard did go away in 1975, but it was a muddled process between 71 and 75. But again, you talk to people who were there, they say that they did think we were going to get back to a gold standard, but of course we never did. But it was replaced by something. It was replaced by the dollar standard. From 1980 to 2010, the world was on a de facto dollar standard. And this was through Republican and Democratic administrations. James Baker during the Reagan and Bush administrations, Bob Rubin during the Clinton administration, and Greenspan and Volcker and others said, we're going to make the dollar a stable store of value. You, our trading partners, can anchor to the dollar. No more gold standard, but we'll have a dollar standard. And that's what the world had with excellent growth and moderate inflation for about 30 years from 1980 to 2010. In 2010, we tore up the deal. We began Currency War III. And I only make the point that the world is not always in a currency war, but when we are, they can last a very long time. Go back and look at the history of Currency War I, Currency War II. These lasted 15, 20 years. This new currency war began in 2010. This is 2015. We're only 5 years into it. It's not going away soon. I expect it to go on for at least another 10 years, unless the system collapses, which is possible. There are only two ways out of a currency war. One is systemic reform, where the countries get together in kind of a new Bretton Woods type deal. The other one is systemic collapse, where the system actually breaks down and then you're forced to reform the system. It's just an uglier version of a systemic reform because you have the collapse first. One or the other, but until then this currency war is going to continue. And here's a quick recap of where we've been. 2009, you all remember the cheap yuan. Remember Secretary Geithner complaining ad nauseum, the Chinese, they're currency manipulators, they're cheapening their currency, they're stealing our exports, etc. But by 2011, it was the U.S. that had the cheap dollar. 2011, the dollar hit an all-time low. The Fed has a broad trade-weighted index, and on that index, the dollar hit an all-time low in August 2011. By the way, I'm sure a lot of you remember the date. That was when gold hit an all-time high. But that's no surprise. Gold's just another form of money. So think about it. When the dollar is at an all-time low, the dollar price of gold is going to be at an all-time high. That's just two sides of the same coin. It's just a cross rate, like the euro dollar or the yen dollar. This was the gold dollar exchange rate. So no surprise that those two things happened at the same time. That worked. We did get a little temporary growth. By the way, you can get temporary growth by cheapening your currency. You just don't get permanent growth, and you don't do anything for the world. It doesn't help world growth. It can help an individual trading area, but not the world as a whole. So by 2013, Japan was suffering, so the U.S. said, okay, it's your turn. You can have the cheap yen. And this was December 2012. They announced Abenomics, the three arrows. He only, fiscal reform, structural reform, fiscal stimulus, and cheap currency. They only did one, which was the cheap currency. They haven't done the structural reform or the fiscal reform. But Japan got the cheap yen, and they got a lift. So who's suffering the whole time? You know, China, weak yuan, weak dollar, weak yen. Who's suffering the whole time? Europe. This was the age of the strong euro. When you go back to 2012, you know, our friends Paul Krugman, Nouriel Roubini, Joe Stiglitz are running around with their hair on fire saying, you know, Grexit, Greece is going to get kicked out, Spain has to quit the euro, go back to the peseta, cheapen your currency, lower your unit labor costs, you know, Europe's falling apart, northern tier, southern tier. And I said, no. I said, none of that is happening. Nobody's getting kicked out. Nobody's quitting. They'll be adding members. The euro is strong and getting stronger. And that's exactly the way it played out. When I said that, the Eurozone had 16 members. Today it has 19 members. They're getting ready to admit their 20th. This is the Fourth Reich. Margaret Thatcher in 1992 was bitterly opposed to German reunification. And her analysis was simple. She said every time the Germans get together, they take over Europe, which is true. That goes all the way back to Charlemagne. Well, they're doing it again, but they're not doing it with military weapons. They're doing it with financial weapons. They're doing it with the euro. So this is the German takeover of Europe. It's kind of why the UK is thinking of Brexit. And I said there wouldn't be a Grexit, and I was right. But there might be a Brexit. Keep an eye on that, because they're like, you know, we're getting out of this German thing. But that strong euro gave Europe 2 recessions in 5 years. So finally we said to Europe, okay, you can have the cheap euro. And the euro went from $1.30 to $1.05 over the course of 2014. It hit a interim low in January 2015 of $1.05. They did that with negative interest rates in July 2014 and European quantitative easing in January 2015. Now, the way I analogize this, the way to think about it, let's say you've got 5 soldiers and they're fighting. And they're fighting all day and it's 100 degrees and everyone's dying of thirst. And you have one canteen. What do? You pass the canteen. Like, everybody would like to drink the whole canteen, but you're in it together. So you take a sip, you hand it to the next guy, he takes a sip, and so on. Everybody takes a sip. That's the way to understand the currency wars. We're passing the canteen from China to the United States to Japan to Europe, hoping everybody can get a sip and their economies will grow a little bit. But there's a big problem. The Fed committed a world historic blunder. I think we'll look back in the future to what happened in 2012, 2013, and that will be compared to the Fed blunders in 1927-28 that led to the stock market crash and the Great Depression, which is the following. The assumption was that the United States was strong enough to bear a strong dollar. They're like, okay, we're good. We had our cheap dollar. We're growing. You guys can have the cheap euro and the cheap yen because the U.S. economy is robust enough to deal with a stronger dollar. That was based on the Fed forecast. If the Fed has the worst forecasting record of anyone. Don't ever think the Fed knows what they're doing. They don't. I've spoken to members of the Board of Governors, Regional Reserve Bank presidents, the head of monetary economics, past and present, and privately they will tell you, they've said to me, we don't know what we're doing. It's an experiment. We'll try something. No, seriously, if it works, we'll do a little more. If it doesn't work, we'll do something else. They've had 15 policies in 6 years. I mean, take QE1, QE2, QE3, which had 2 parts, nominal GDP targeting, currency wars, forward guidance, which came in 9 different flavors. Remember Operation Twist? I mean, go back and look at the list. 15 policies in 6 years should tell you that they don't know what they're doing, which they don't. They also don't know how to model the economy. Every year, the Fed has a 1-year forward forecast. They go, okay, here's what we think is going to happen. So 2009, they forecast 2010. 2010, they forecast 2011. So go back and take a look. They were wrong 6 years in a row by orders of magnitude. Not like, oh, we said 3.1% growth. It came in 3. I would say, nice job, guys. That's pretty good. No, they said like 3.5% growth. It was, 1.9. Then they said 2.9. It was 1.7. I mean, we've had 2.2% growth for the last 6 years, averaging in the 6 years. And we saw yesterday GDP for the third quarter came in, third quarter came in at 1.5%, way below the Fed's 2.5% forecast, down from their earlier forecast of 3.5. They don't know what they're doing. They can't forecast. So they said, the economy's getting stronger. You guys can have the weak euro because we can bear a strong dollar. So now the U.S. is going into recession. The world is going into recession. That's what I expect in 2016. The U.S. is getting close to the point where we're going to have to take the canteen back. We're going to have to go back to the cheap dollar. So I look for a stronger dollar, weaker euro next year. Weaker dollar, stronger euro. Apologize. So look for a weaker dollar next year. The other thing going on, I think a lot of you are familiar with, is that China, the IMF is getting ready to include the Chinese yuan in the special drawing right. And I say special drawing right, and people are like, what the heck is that? SDR for short. It's kind of out there. It's the easiest way to understand it, and it's really easy. Like, don't get bogged down in all the detail. The special drawing right is world money. It's world money, printed by the central bank of the world, which is the International Monetary Fund. Why don't they just call it world money? Well, why don't they call the Federal Reserve the central bank of the United States? Well, the reason for that is Americans hate central banks. So they say, if we're going to have one, call it something else so Americans won't know what it is. That's worked pretty well. The special drawing right, if you called it world money, sounds a little scary, so let's call it something that sounds like it came out of a PhD thesis, which they did. People don't understand it. It's world money. It's printed by the IMF. It's handed out to the members. We don't have it. You can't use it at the bar tonight. We don't have it as walking around money. But it is handed out to the members. It's not backed by anything. People will tell you, oh, it's backed by a basket of 4 currencies. Those 4 currencies are there to calculate the value. It's an 8th grade math problem, so you can figure out, was an SDR, is it worth $1.40 or $1.50? Today it's worth about $1.40. So that's why they have those 4 currencies, so you can do the math, but it's not actually backed by anything. This is fiat money printed by the central bank of the world, handed out to the members. The next time there's a financial collapse, the central banks are tapped out. The Fed took their balance sheet from $800 billion to $4 trillion. You all know that. The People's Bank of China actually printed more money than the Fed. Bank of Japan, Bank of England, European Central Bank, they're all in the same boat. They're all, one's as bad as the other. And so the problem is that the next time there's a crisis, a liquidity crisis, and everybody wants their money back, which is a good definition of a liquidity crisis, the central banks aren't going to be able to print it. The IMF is going to print it, flood the zone with trillions of SDRs. That will be highly inflationary, and that's kind of one way out of the global catastrophe. But they want to include China in that bucket. It's a big deal for the Chinese. It's going to happen. They'll announce it next March. It's going to be effective September 30th. So this is the end game. This is the way out of all the problems of money printing, too much deflation, et cetera. I'm about out of time. I have 2 hours of material left, which I can't do, but we'll do some of it this afternoon in the science lesson. I just want to jump ahead to so I'll spend a minute on this slide. This is Yellen's problem. By the way, I said in November 2014, a year ago, categorically, that the Fed would not raise interest rates in 2015. And we got the videotapes there, we got the interviews and all that to back that up. They have 8 meetings a year. 7 meetings are done. They haven't raised rates. So I feel like I'm like first and goal on the 2-yard line. So that forecast is holding up pretty well. But here's the problem. Yellen wants inflation. It's not a secret. The Fed says it ad nauseum. We want 2% inflation. Okay, we want 2% inflation. They want to raise rates. Not a secret. How many times have they said that? You're sick of hearing it. But if you raise rates, the dollar gets stronger, and that's deflationary. So how does that work? You want inflation, you want to raise interest rates, but raising interest rates is deflationary. How does that work? The answer is it doesn't work. You can't raise rates. That's the problem, because they'll sink the U.S. economy, they'll sink the emerging markets. I'm saying they can't raise rates as far as the eye can see. I may, talk to me a year from now. I'll change my forecast if we get some new data. Based on everything I see now, they absolutely cannot do it. If I'm wrong, and they do, look out, because there'll be no bottom to the emerging markets collapse. There will be global contagion, going back to that network slide I showed earlier. What stays in China, what goes on in China does not stay in China these days. It comes back to the United States. So my forecast is they won't raise rates. I actually think the Fed's next move will be towards easing. I look for them to ease through reintroduction of forward guidance in March of 2016. I got to jump ahead. I'm just going to finish with the collapse of the international monetary system. By the way, it sounds scary, but it happens. It happened 3 times in the past 100 years. It will happen again. It's not the end of the world. We don't all go live in caves and eat baked beans and counter ammunition. We'll all go to work the next day. But what it does mean is that the major financial and trading powers will sit down around the table and they will recut the deal. They will reform the international monetary system, as they did in Genoa in 1922, Bretton Woods in 1944, and Washington, D.C. in 1971. They'll do it again. So what investors need to know is, okay, what does the new system look like? You got SDRs, already talked about that, highly inflationary. It's easy to get some gold, real estate, silver, land, fine art, real assets. The other one is a new gold standard. Gold standard is some relationship between gold and paper money. There are a lot of ways to do it. This is who has the gold. One of the reasons I've been bullish on the euro, where's my pointer? Okay, well, I can't find my, sorry, here it is. I thought it was on the thing I'm holding. Notice that the people with the most gold in the world are Europeans. U.S. has 8,000 tons, but Europe has 10,000 tons. If you combine the 19 members of the European Monetary Zone, they have 10,000 tons more than the United States. The IMF hates gold. Why are they sitting on 3,000 tons? But they do. Here's our friends China, Swiss, Russia, et cetera. This is everybody else. There are no big holders in here. But basically, China actually is up here. I'm not showing it, but they're about 4,000 tons. So China, the IMF, Europe, and the United States, in the end game, these are the only powers that really matter. If you go back to a gold standard, I'm not saying the world will have a gold standard. I'm not saying that, because they want to do the SDR thing. But the problem with SDRs is just another form of fiat money. If it works, it will only be because nobody understands it. But if you actually look through it, you say, hey, you guys print all this money, you ruined the system, now you're printing more money, how does that work? It might not. There's no central bank in the world that wants a gold standard, not one. But they may have to go to a gold standard to restore confidence if things get bad enough. And if you do that, you have to ask yourself a question. What is the non-deflationary price of gold? Because you all know the rap is, there's not enough gold in the world to have a gold standard because, there's not enough to finance world trade and finance and all that. Well, there's not enough at $1,200 an ounce, but there's plenty of gold at $10,000 an ounce. In other words, it's not about the quantity, it's about the price. You can support any amount of credit financing world trade if you get the price right. And the math is not that difficult, but GM1 down there, global money supply, and when I say global, I mean US, ECB, and China. Global money supply with 40% backing, that's not 100% backing, it's 40% backing. That comes to about $7,000 an ounce. This one here, this is global M2 with 100% backing is $44,000 an ounce. Now, I'm not predicting $44,000 gold. Don't say Jim Rickards says gold's going to 40,000. I'm just showing you this is 8th grade math. This is not secret stuff. If you want 100% backing, which the Austrians do, you got to put gold at $44,000 an ounce. If you're happy with 40% backing with M1, $7,000 an ounce is fine. Not made up numbers, it's very simple math. The point is, if you don't hit these numbers, it's deflationary, because if you want to peg at a lower price, you have to reduce the money supply, which is deflationary. So if you want the implied non-deflationary price of gold in a gold standard, these are the numbers you get to. It's one of the reasons I like gold. I'm going to skip over this and just do, I do expect the system to collapse, and I think this will be an impetus for neo-fascism, so watch that space. And a shameless plug for my books, if you're interested. Everything I've said here, by the way, including things I didn't say because I ran out of time, is in my books, Currency Wars and the Death of Money. I have a new book coming out in April. It's available on pre-sale on Amazon right now. It's called The New Case for Gold. Emphasizing the word new, you all know this is a gold-oriented audience. You know the arguments for and against gold. You've heard them all. You've heard them ad nauseum. But there's a new 21st century case for gold. There are new reasons to have gold over and above the ones we've been talking about for the last 50 years, including digital threats and financial warfare. That's not something we talked about 20 years ago or 40 years ago because it didn't exist. But in a world where your assets can be wiped out with a few keystrokes, I think that's a 21st century reason to have gold over and above all the other reasons. And I do have a few newsletters, which our introducer mentioned, and Strategic Intelligence is our monthly newsletter. And I thank you very much.